Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Mike Catafo. I run West Coast Go-to-Market at SecurityPal, and joining us on today's episode of Insecurity is Lee Vorthman, Chief Security Officer of Oracle's advertising business. And today our topic is leadership, and specifically, how you influence culture as a security leader. Thanks for joining us, Lee. It's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
You bet. Before we get into the topic of the day, would love to hear your story about how you became the Chief Information Security Officer of Oracle's advertising business.
Well, it's a long and winding tale. I'll give the abbreviated version is I think, people that land in this role are naturally curious about technology, and not necessarily in a way that is how I can use technology, but how can I break that technology? And I think if you have that mindset, you are destined to become a CISO, right? And so to give you my short history is that when I first started working, my very first job, I worked for a company that eventually got acquired by Intel, but I was working as an admin there, a system administrator doing like Microsoft Active Directory and Exchange and stuff like that. And I was fascinated by the fact that someone could make software behave in a way that was unintended, that would result in, a compromise or someone getting access to your network or what it was. And I just was fascinated by it. And that led down the path of learning all the different skill sets of how the OSI networking model works and how, software exploits work and things like that. And I think, CISOs tend to be generalists, right? You want to know a lot about a lot of different things, because that makes you more effective. And that's been certainly the true of my career history. And, from defense space to private companies to large companies to startups and things like that have eventually landed me in this role. And it's fun, keeps me busy.
Cool. So parents, if any parents are listening and their kids are love breaking stuff or taking things apart and they probably shouldn't, or they get mad at them, then hey, your kid could become a CISO one day, or it sounds like he's interested in the right things.
If you get them a lock picking kit, that you can get on Amazon, and they tear that thing up, destined to be a CISO probably someday.
I love it. You've got a really interesting blog, 370 Security, and you write about a number of different things. I'm curious, how you got into writing and where that came from.
Yeah, I've had a varying degree of different companies that have been more or less active in the marketing space. And the best that I was at was a previous company that would just continually shove me in certain things. And my current company doesn't do that, which is fine. But I want to be part of the conversation, right? I want to share my experiences, share my thoughts, because, the reality is if I'm thinking of it, someone else is probably thinking of that too. And then I'm sure people also have questions of what is it like to be a CISO? What is it like to be in that role? What are the things that you think about? And so I haven't really found, another source of information of someone that's actually writing about things that they experience. And I try to anonymize it from my current role. But at the same time, right, the topics that I write about are things that I think about every day to try and make my role or my organization better. And so really it's kind of like a pay it forward thing. I want to lead the conversation, but I also want to help someone else out if they can learn from that. And that's what got started. So I set a goal for myself. I want to say it was last Christmas. I was I'm going to go start this, and just started. And once the floodgates open, I keep a running notepad on my phone, and I just write down topics, and they turn into blog posts, and it's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, that's super cool. So for those of you listening, it's 370 Security, right?
370security.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn and click on my blog if you want to look at it that way too.
Oh, I love it. Great. I enjoyed your last post about the dichotomy of security, which I think is a pretty good segue into our current topic, or the topic of the day, which is around leadership, and particularly how you influence or think about how you influence culture as a security leader. I'm curious, almost how you starting from a 60,000 foot view. How, I guess any type of frameworks or things you've picked up over your career of how you even begin to start organizing and thinking about it as a security leader.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a number of great frameworks out there. NIST has a couple. There's CIS. There's the Cloud Security Alliance. There's ISO. I think that we live in a day and age where fortunately people have paved the way for us, that we can come through and we can pick something that best suits our company to get started. So I'd say if someone is an aspiring CISO or is just starting out or even just wants to re-baseline their program, go for one of those, pick one that suits best. You can also make your own. I don't fully recommend it. It's a lot of work, right? And there's some advantages, right, to picking out a framework. But yeah, there's, I think there's plenty of information out there. And if you don't know where to get started, I'm happy to help. Reach out. No problem.
Nice. What about like just like when you think of like as a leader, obviously there I've heard this before and I'm sure everybody listening to this has, it's like people, process and technology. And if we were just zooming in on the people component of this as a security leader, like how do you even think about getting started? I mean, there's just so much there relative to almost any other leader at an organization other than maybe the CEO. How do you begin to start, unraveling that or thinking about that, particularly if you're just joining a company or maybe you've been there for, 3 to 6 months and just getting your footing?
Yeah, I liken this question to my time back in the military, which is as when you're on the carrier, right? There's the surface warfare designation. There's also the air warfare designation, right? That you get on the ships, and it sounds fancy, but really all it is you're understanding how that entire organization operates. And I liken the same thing, right? We can sit with the military analogy is in the Marines, right? Every Marine is a rifleman, right? And I think for a CISO coming into an organization, you need to understand what that business is, like why they do the things they're doing, what do they like to do and what's their risk tolerance. And certainly like you said, the people there, it's like it's not just about the salespeople, it's not just about the products that you sell, right? There's people in finance and HR, and there's going to be people all over the place that you have to talk to. And that's the hardest part, right? Is developing those relationships and convincing those people that you are their ally, as opposed to the person that's going to come in and make their job more difficult, which can happen, right? But hopefully that's for a good reason and not just one that's like kind of punitive, right? So yeah, people are the hardest problem. I always say it's easy to deploy technology, right? Because you deploy it and it's done. And I know it's being a little bit hyperbolic, but you deploy it and it's done, right? Yeah, you maintain it. But like if someone doesn't want to do something, I mean, you can be a great psychologist and get paid a lot of money by trying to convince someone that they should be, not be a unicorn or whatever it's going to be. Right. So that's the hard part, right? Changing psychology.
Totally. I don't know if you've got a story from like a past company, or maybe even like as an observer where like somebody's done a really good job. Could be you, could be somebody else of like, you run into the wall of like resistance to change, and how do you just get over that? Or how do you, help influence folks to get over that when you think about affecting change?
Yeah, I'll give the sad story first, which is I worked at a company and I'd only been there a couple months, and I put my plan together and the whole strategy, and here's what we need to do, and here's where your risks were. And I rolled in there, and the acting CEO at the time told me that this was when he was like, oh, this is the boogeyman pitch. And he was like, I don't believe in all this stuff, and I think we have a better chance of getting hit by a bus than having a cyber incident. I was like, okay, that's cool. I know where I stand, right? I happened to go to a conference that day in Denver, and I got called that afternoon, and we'd had a breach. And completely destroyed the entire like Amazon environment, had to be rebuilt. And I kind of was like, told you so, right? Now that's not like the best analogy because, that was an environment that was very difficult. But, I do think, look, coming in and trying, and the first problem is having people acknowledge and understand and accept that there's a problem. And if they don't accept that there's a problem, you're not going to be successful. And that's really, you have to speak their language, and I know it sounds silly, but it's like, what do they do on the weekends? Do they like racing cars? Or do they like going to dog shows? Or do they like playing video games? It's like, come up with an analogy that links it back to them so that they can understand it and it can be personal to them. Because if you come in there and you're like, well, I need, $11 billion to go do this thing. And they're like, I don't see it. You're not going to be successful in that role. Right. So I do think a lot of, the CISO role is on the softer side of skills, which is like, you're trying to form alliances and then navigate this very narrow path of allowing the business, or not allowing, but helping the business, right, manage the risks that they want to take to make money, because that's why they're there, while at the same time, having them do it in as safe a way possible that doesn't impede them. And it's tough. And you have to, like I said, the biggest thing is convincing people that there's a problem. And then once you can convince there's a problem, talking about that solution and what's a reasonable solution is where most of our time is spent, right?
Yeah. Well, let's. You said that was you were starting with a sad story first. Is there a happy story where you've been, with sans breach, been able to like at least affect change to avoid something like that, or seen
Yeah.
somebody else do it?
Yeah, I've definitely had, the happy story at, in my current role where I've been able to come in and, form a lot of relationships at a lot of different levels and, you know, um, basically affect that change that you want to see. Right. And I'm trying not to give like super specifics, but I do think that's been the happy story, right? Is like you learn from your mistakes. You learn, that you come into a company that, maybe has the openness that they want to do things, right? Or you walk into a problem set, but they're willing to accept that because they understand the problem. And in my current role, definitely have, been successful in that and getting, the risk profile to be more favorable, to implement, specific controls and frameworks to form those alliances now where, what's interesting is, I'll again give the military analogy is like, in the military, they were always like, well, reputation is everything. And I think it's the same thing in the business, right? Is that if you're cry wolf, for a CISO, and the sky is always falling and it never falls, not the best, right? And on the flip side, if you don't tell them that there's risk there and then they get, hit, then that's not good either. And so you have to navigate this line. And I think how you approach those problems and being reasonable about it really impacts whether or not the business wants to work with you. So yeah, my happy story is my current role has been fantastic to work for. They've been super supportive. I feel like I've been largely successful. We could do a 360 review. I'm sure my peers would probably have some other comments, but no, it's been great. And I think, it's just the progression of learning, how to be more successful in the roles. It's people. That's what it is.
Yeah, that's well. One, I failed to say this earlier, but thanks for your service.
Likewise.
And it's always great to have a veteran on the show and meet another one. I'm kind of curious, like going back to your days in the Navy, like any either leadership stories or anything that you picked up on that you apply today, or you think is like really valuable in how you lead teams or influence change?
I try to bring from the military, at least what I appreciate from the military is like candor. It's like if you're standing in front of your commanding officer, like they're generally not going to be like, well, we don't really felt like you did the best job. They're going to be like, we're terrible. Like get your stuff together, sort yourself out and come back here tomorrow or whatever it is. And, obviously we're, not always dealing with veterans or military people. So you can't really always be that direct, but I do think candor, if someone's struggling, like, they're not going to get it if you're not being more direct with them. And that doesn't mean you have to be hurtful about it. But I do think that, they appreciate the fact that you're telling them the truth, you're being direct, you're having a candid conversation with them, and then you're giving them a way to kind of go forward. So I try to take that same approach in my leadership style. And then I'm also super protective of my team, right? I want them to succeed, but I'm also not going to handhold them through it. And, I view my job as an executive is to buffer them from the noise of the politics at the upper levels, which same in the military, right? Some captain isn't going to like filter down, his politics with the admiral down to you as a lowly seaman, right? But, at the same time, like you might have to deal with one or two levels up or above. And so definitely there's a ton of, I don't know how long we got, but there's a ton of like lessons that we could draw in from the military that I think are super important. And I do notice that the people that I continue to serve with in the civilian world that have been military get those things. And it's usually really easy for me to work with them because we have the same kind of wavelength on those type of stuff. So,
Yeah, no, I think it's candor is one of those things that, there's, I think, an art form to it of like how you deliver it and then also like how you receive it and how you're able to communicate through that type of dynamic. I don't think anybody ever wants to hear the news they're not doing well or they didn't do something well. But I also think at the same time, the flip side of that or the dichotomy to your blog post is like everybody wants that. So I don't think anybody wants to live in a world where they don't get that. So
look, there's techniques where you can sandwich it and stuff like that, but it's like you want them to walk away with the feedback because otherwise they're not going to grow, right? It's just like same with like weightlifting or running, right? If you don't do the work, if you don't stress yourself, you're not going to grow. And it's the same thing with this. You're stressing that person to improve and they're going to improve or they won't, right? And if you don't give them that stressor, and I'm not, again, I know that's not saying being mean about it, like tear them down so they're crying, but at the same time, it's like, you're not cutting it. Here's why, right? Here's what we need to do to improve. I always appreciate it when my bosses did it, because I don't want to walk away from there and be like, wait, what do I have to do? Like,
Yeah, totally.
that's not good,
What about in a like a cross department scenario where it's like you're not necessarily managing somebody, but it's maybe another leader, and you're trying to affect change in terms of just like how people approach security outside of the security team or IT team. And maybe you've got a conflict of like, okay, we got a vendor we may need to get rid of. There was a breach, or we need to change the relationship, but it's a critical function. How do you navigate that type of conversation or situation as a leader?
Yeah, I think the important thing is to not roll in there and be like, it's my way or the highway. I do think that it needs to be a business discussion, right? And at the end of the day, I'd say probably 80 or 90% of the job of a CISO is to advise, right? It's like having a consigliere of insurance like on your staff, right? And so, if we come in and give you a recommendation and say, look, this is super risky, or, this vendor has a poor performance history. We've audited them several times. They clearly don't follow, industry best practices, whatever it is. And we're giving you that recommendation to switch vendors. I think that's something that me as a business leader, hopefully we have that trust that we've built over time. I would listen to my CISO and say, okay, well, what can we do about this? I don't think rolling in there and just being like, get rid of them because they suck is not going to be very helpful. And look, maybe they're the only one that makes that certain type of widget, and you got to do business with them, right? And so that you have to have that conversation about what's an acceptable level of risk. What can we do to manage that and go forward? I think the biggest thing is like, as a CISO, it's like demonstrating empathy towards the rest of the business. Like, you need to understand where they're coming from, right? They got to make money. And then I want them to understand where I'm coming from, which is like, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to protect you from hurting yourself type thing. Like, let's not run with scissors. Maybe you should run with a spatula instead, right? Or whatever it is, right? So,
I love that.
I think there's a little bit of coming across the aisle, right? And trying to figure out where both are coming from. And then, look, I can make a recommendation. They can be like, nah, we don't buy that. Okay, great. I told you, at least I told you, at least I advised you on that thing, because it would be way worse for me to not say anything and then be like, yeah, I knew that.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
what am I doing? So I think it's just having that kind of candid conversation about like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know they were the only one that did that thing. Great. Let's figure out a way together to make money, because that's why we're here. Right. So.
Interesting. I love it. It's almost like you're showing up. You're like, I'm here to say yes.
I'm here to say,
I'm here to say yes, but
it's Occam's razor. It's like it's on the knife edge of like about to say no. Convince me, right? I want to say yes, but also look, I can't expect someone who has expertise in HR or finance or even a lot of software engineering doesn't have the expertise, right, to understand why I'm saying something I'm saying. If I'm saying like, hey, there's a input validation error in your web application, which can cause customer data to be exploited and breached in your backend database, they're going to be like, what? And like, this is what my wife says. She says, are you speaking bits and bytes again? And we're like, sure, okay, right. But you have to translate that in business sense, which is like, hey, someone can get access to our backend database. This is going to be bad. We will be in the news. Let's have that conversation. You're there to like translate, right, to business sense and help them understand why it's a problem, so that then they can go back and prioritize their teams or whatever it is to be able to fix that issue that they're seeing. Because, I mean, like I said to you earlier, the CISO doesn't own 90% of the things in the business. I mean, unless you're like a security company that makes products or sells services, which is probably not the majority of the people that are listening to this. I mean, so the example would be like, if you're a CISO at your company, sure, he owns those things. But for my company, we don't own those things, right? And so I have to go convince that engineering leader or the HR leader or that finance person, like, this is a problem. Let's go do these things. This is what this means. Don't click on that link to send $2 million to the prince in Nigeria. That's not going to work out well for you.
So what, like, I mean, you bring up a great point about like, you don't own, it's like your scope of responsibility is pretty broad and probably touches almost everybody, right? In terms of somebody clicks on a link, it's kind of your fault. I mean, is there anything you do as a leader with other leaders in the organization, or even in something that just touches folks continuously, to sort of like stay on top of that type of risk?
Well, I think most companies do, regular training, right? Security awareness training. And so, you're trying to reinforce the psychology, right, of certain patterns of behavior to like, hey, if you see an email and it's weird, like, don't click on that. Like, let's do something different, right? That's just, patterns of behavior and skill reinforcement. But I do think, it's regularly syncing with the leaders across the organization is super important, right? Because, CISOs are one of the few functions, right, that do cut across all of the business because their responsibility is to manage risk for the entire business. So you have to understand all the different parts of the business, understand the relationships, understand what they do, what do they care about, right? And I hate the phrase like "what keeps you up at night" because everyone asks that, but what keeps them up at night, right? What keeps me up at night, and let's figure out where there's overlap and go from there. So, honestly, like I said, I spend the majority of my time interfacing with my peers and other people above me and forming those relationships because, you don't want to go to them only when there's emergencies, right? You don't want to be like, hey, help me out, like with this. Like you want to have that foundation of that relationship that you can call on so that, the majority of your interactions with them aren't emergencies until it does need to be one, right? Because if you just reach out to them when it's an emergency, it's going to be really a trying relationship.
Yeah, no, I mean, you brought this up earlier. I think it's probably worth going a level deeper on because I think it's really interesting and about how you form these alliances internally and the relationships. Like, are there particular folks? It could be peers, other executives that you're like, okay, here's my top like 5 or 10 people that like I in order for us to have like a pretty robust sort of cybersecurity program, practices, et cetera, like we all got to be on the same page. Are there like a list of folks that you were like, okay, I need to go meet with these people, or is it just, or different types of functions? I'm curious, like how you looked at that.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would say it's going to depend on the structure of the organization. But look, if I was coming in to a new organization as like the top level CISO, somewhere reporting in the C-suite, maybe to the CIO, maybe to the CTO, maybe to the CEO, maybe some other C-level, I would definitely form relationships with every single one of those people, right? Because it sounds stupid where you're like, I'm not going to need to talk to HR. Well, you might, right? If that person repeatedly clicks, if there's a user in your organization that repeatedly clicks on a link or repeatedly does something, right, that is clearly in violation of your company policy and they're putting the business at risk, you might need to have HR come in and take action against that person to remove them so that you're removing that risk from the business. You might think, oh, I don't need to talk to the CFO or the chief legal officer. Well, you might, right? If you get sued because of an incident, you can guarantee the chief legal officer is going to be in there. The CFO is probably going to be approving your budget, right? The CTO definitely wants to be aligned with whatever technology you're doing. So does the CIO
Wow,
to
yeah.
make sure that you're not, it's like every single part of the business is super relevant down to the engineering functions and how they write products and make applications or make whatever that they're making for your company. So like I come back to, like I said, I spend a lot of my time just networking and talking to people. And I'm not talking necessarily always about business, even though we do spend a large portion of that time. What are you seeing here? What are you seeing here? Like, coordinating as an intelligence person, coordinating a lot of the things and putting the dots, where I can, oh, that makes sense. But I spend a lot of time just talking about personal stuff. What are you watching on Netflix? What books are you reading? Because like that's commonality, right? That you can fall back on when you have it. So yeah, my advice is, depending on your organizational structure, right? Identify the key people in your sphere and then, meet with those people. And if you find out that that's not the right person, okay, well, maintain that relationship, but find out who that person is, go build that relationship and then just keep going and keep going. And eventually you'll have that sphere that you need when you need to call on it.
Something I probably needed to hear 10 years ago when I was starting out on
We all did,
the
right?
revenue leadership side.
We're just laying waste in our younger selves.
I know. It's super cool. I think what else? I guess like when you think of keys as a security leader, and we've touched on a lot. Anything else that you think is like so like instrumental in your ability to affect change as a leader, particularly on the security side? Like we've talked about relationships and like alliances internally. Like what that sounds like that's probably paramount. Because like if you don't have that, it sounds like everything else kind of breaks down. Is there anything else in tandem with that, or anything else that you're like, oh yeah, no, this is something that's like super critical to have?
That's a good question. It depends, honestly, on the psychology of that person. And I know we don't have a ton of time, but like you, I don't know in your sales role if you've ever taken like psychology training about how to sell better to a customer. And I've done some of it like 10 years ago where like they have different quadrants of people, like one's logical and one's emotional and one's, whatever, like there's 4 different quadrants. And the reason I bring this up is like some people, you can go to them and be like, well, it's company policy or it's a regulation, it's a law, we have to follow it. They'll be like, oh, okay, we have to do that. And some people will be like, I don't care. And okay, well, you have to understand like what's winning for them, right? What winning for them is, I don't know, getting a product out the door faster. Okay, well, how can I work with that, right? Winning for them might be getting all their people raises or, going to a dog show on the weekend or whatever it is. And so like, I always kind of think back to that like psychological quadrant of stuff where it's like, and same with like situational leadership, right? From the military is like, you can't apply the same thing all the time to different people. You have to kind of figure out what makes them tick and then kind of go from there. So yeah, the relationships are good, but I'm constantly trying to change different techniques and try and figure out different situations. Like one of my first blog posts that I wrote was interesting. There were some techniques that I learned at my past company, and we used to call it we called it the switcheroo. And the reason we call it this is because we were trying to get like this zero trust strategy implement at our other company. And what happened was we kept talking to these people and everyone was like, yeah, that makes sense. But nothing would happen. And we finally found out by digging into a certain group that like their kind of self-identity was being threatened by switching to this new strategy because they didn't see themselves as having a job in the future, which wasn't true. I mean, there's definitely things to do, but they couldn't see it. So we had to convince them. So after like months and months and months of me and my senior technical guy having conversations with these people, they're like, nope, that's not going to work. Nope, that's not going to work. And we're like, man, like we're just beating our heads against the wall. Why won't this work? And finally, my guy, he goes, okay, we've heard about why it won't work. Tell me why it would work. And like, it switched the whole conversation. And then they were like, well, you could do it this way. And then it was like, boom, the floodgates were open. And it's like, sometimes you just need to like kick someone out of like their rut a little bit and like pivot them. And we called it the switcheroo, and it super worked. So I know I'm off on a tangent, but like,
no, this is great. I mean, this is, these are the things. I mean, I know if I'm listening, this is like something I just think is incredibly valuable to know, or just think of like in terms of if you get stuck, it's like just flip the thing 180 and ask that different question. That's super interesting. Switcheroo.
I mean, a good sales thing, right? Well, I can't buy this today. Well, when could you buy it? Tell me a reason why you would buy it, right? And it's like in The Wolf of Wall Street, right, where he's like, sell me this pen. He's like, write this down. He's like, I don't have it. Like, it's like, you switch someone's mentality, So yeah, there's been a lot of like subtle lessons that not just building the relationships, but I spend a lot of time like trying to read like psychology books about like what makes people tick and why doesn't this work and all that type of stuff. Cause I think that's really honestly what most of our job is, Tech is easy. People are hard. That should be my byline.
I love it. No, this has been great, man. I appreciate you obviously making time for this, especially on a Monday. I know you're busy, and really, really enjoyed having you on the show, and would welcome you back anytime.
Yeah, I'd love it. Anytime.
Appreciate it, Lee.
Cool.
All right.
See ya.
Bye-bye.